I didn't understand at the time why we were all in this weird space around money all the time. And so I think this book is really the culmination of decades of financial fumblings and failures and frustrations to be able to help other people avoid some of those pitfalls.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Today, we're sitting down with Doug Lynam, Marine, monk, money coach, and author of Taming Your Money Monster. Doug doesn't just help people build better budgets, he helps them untangle the deep wounds, attachment patterns, and spiritual beliefs that shape how we handle money. We talk about money not as a neutral tool, but as something we carry stories about. Stories that often go back to childhood, shaped by shame, fear, or control. Doug shares how the Enneagram and attachment theory can help us make sense of our financial habits and, more importantly, heal them. He offers a vision of financial health that's rooted in authenticity, generosity, and service to a broken world. If you've ever felt anxious around money, avoided looking at your bank account, or struggled to align your finances with your deepest values, join us. Here is my conversation with Doug Lynam. Doug, welcome to Shifting Culture. Excited to have you on. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Joshua. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dig into Taming Your Money Monster. This is going to be a fun conversation because you're an enigma to me. Like, you got the Marines, you're a Benedictine monk, you were a financial advisor, you're a writer and coach. Like, who are you? And how did you get here? This is your life is fascinating to me. So take us into, like, where did this faith and money come into play?
Well, I grew up in a fairly affluent family where money, we had plenty of it, but it was from my limited childhood perspective, it felt weaponized, like in the sense of, kind of, you're in this kind of play to pay kind of scheme where you behave how your parents want you to behave and you get stuff. And, that's a certain way of enforcing a certain compliance. And I suppose it has some benefits. And yet I think it also created a lot of resentment in my brothers and I. We all eventually at some point in our lives took a vow of poverty in very different ways. I ran off and joined the monastery for 20 years. My twin brother ran off and became a homesteader up in upstate Vermont. And my older brother took off to Seattle and joined a moderately successful grunge band. So we were all very poor by any sense of any imagination of that word. But I guess what I realized over time, after about, I think as I said, I was there 20 years in the monastery, but around year 3, the monastery was facing severe financial hardship because it turns out that I was living in a community where we all hated money and none of us wanted to deal with it. And we took the vow of poverty a little too seriously and ended up in bankruptcy, where the community had, many, many years and many decades of mismanagement and a lot of deferred maintenance and things like that. So over time that really built up and someone had to solve that problem. And for whatever reason, it fell on my shoulders. And, I did. So I went to a bookstore and got all the books on personal finance I could find and realized I was pretty good at doing that. And then I started working with monastery guests who would come to the community with different kinds of spiritual problems. But what I realized later were mostly financial problems, that if you could help people would ask me to pray for them, which of course I did. But I was also like, hey, if we built a budget that might be more effective, like we could actually solve some stuff here rather than just wishing for problems to go away. So let's see what practical steps we could put into place to help you through the various stressors of your life. Because we know from hard research that, the quality of your financial well-being, your perceived financial well-being, has a bigger impact on your overall mental and physical health than almost any other aspect of your life. That, poverty is a giant neon sign pointing to early death this way, because poor people get hit with more things you don't want, like, obesity and drug addiction and alcoholism and domestic abuse and child abuse and crime and all these things and workplace injury. So So if I realized that actually helping people resolve their financial issues was in fact a spiritual practice and one that I found great joy in. And then over time, I think there was a lot of resistance from some of the other monks about some of the work I was doing. They certainly appreciated being financially solvent, and they certainly appreciated the work that I had done. And yet there was, I think, some lingering tension around whether that was something that needed as much time of my time as it did. And that I felt like I was really being called to be of greater service to the world, and being in a monastery held me back. So I left in 2016, and I was in a teaching order. We were all, by the way, we were all working as teachers at the time. And then I went and joined Longview Asset Management here in Santa Fe, where I became a partner. And then I built that book of business up to quite a significant amount, and then exited that business last year to become now a full-time writer and speaker and coach.
One of the things that's, I think, fascinating in your new book is that you're taking financial literacy and our financial problems, but then actually diving deep into some of our hurts and our wounds, our pain, our trauma. So you go into attachment theory, the Enneagram, and helping people really dig deeper underneath the surface.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not just about making a better budget or, trying to will your way into something, but it's actually dealing with your wounds. Where have you found that framework helpful? Why is the Enneagram, attachment, and tending to our wounds helpful when it comes to money?
Well, the Enneagram, what it can tell you is tells you what your deepest childhood wounds are. Essentially, think of the Enneagram as the physics of consciousness. It really provides a clear and robust model that we can now ground in both neurobiology and childhood developmental psychology to understand core aspects of our personality. So your personality has a nature component, kind of how your genes and DNA express themselves, and that's one part. And there's a nature component to it. And the Enneagram tells you the nature part, like what were the biggest stressors or threats in your childhood environment that your ego had to defend and protect itself from. And they were really good at getting you through childhood and helping you to individuate and differentiate, meaning you establishing a unique identity and personality in the world, which we all need to have. But some of those childhood defense mechanisms we're still running off of in our adult lives and maybe aren't as helpful at this point, and maybe getting us into all kinds of, I would say, traffic accidents and fender benders in our adult life. And if we can understand how the Enneagram works, and then, which I could maybe give you an example in a minute, but then on top of the Enneagram, I've layered on top of it what I call the attachment theory of money. And the attachment theory of money is identical to basically what's called the attachment theory of relationships, which says there's two ways that we can have an unhealthy attachment to our romantic partners, which is to be anxiously attached or fearfully avoidant. And so we can have that same relationship to money. We can be anxiously grabbing onto money, kind of like Ebenezer Scrooge, or we can be like someone like myself, who was very fearful and avoidant of it and hated having anything to do with it. And still, I have to sit down and force myself to do my bills, even though I do it well. It's just not my favorite thing to be spending my weekend doing. So those are the kind of so there's in the Enneagram, then there's 9 archetypal ways that a human ego can form. And then there's these 2 money monsters, and the money anxious or money avoidant, that we can then layer on top of it.
Let's go a little bit more into overview of Enneagram and attachments. And then I want to hear your story through the lens of Enneagram and what you did. So
Sure.
To help us get a grasp of it. So give us an overview of maybe the three core wounds of the Enneagram and the sections. I think
Sure.
that might help try to situate ourselves somewhere in this conversation. So what are the 3 core wounds that people have?
Okay. So one way to start that conversation is to imagine what was it like when you were in your mother's womb? Like, what was your consciousness like at that point? And I would hypothesize that you were in a state of unconscious unity, meaning you didn't have a clear sense of self, of what was me or not me. And you were in unity with everything you could experience, even though it's very limited. And so if we can start from that that hypothetical framework, which I think is fair, then you get popped out in the world and surprise, there's more to the universe than just you. And so you have a physical umbilical cord that gets cut, but then almost immediately, well, immediately, in fact, there's a psychological umbilical cord that connects between you and your caregivers. So you need your caregivers to basically drive your ego for you for the first 0 to 5 to 10 years of your life, kind of depending, in gradations, of course, but that egoic codependence forms, and over time, that emotional, egoic, psychological umbilical cord has to be cut through these one of three sharp negative emotions, and the sharpest negative emotions are anger, sadness, and fear. And we know this from the work of a pioneering affective neuroscientist by the name of Jaak Panksepp, did a study on mice and rats several decades ago. And he found that in all mammals, there are these three core negative pieces of circuitry in the mid limbic region of all mammalian brains, of anger, sadness, and fear. And so one of these negative emotions is what's going to do most of the cutting for us of the psychological umbilical cord and causing us to individuate and differentiate from our parents. And it has to be a negative emotion, because positive emotions will just reinforce your connection to your caregiver. So at some point, there's obviously, your parents love us, our parents care for us, all these good things, but at some point, you see kids throwing tantrums, all those things. Those are just normal parts of growing up. And so you've got these three core wounds, but then you've got three ways to process those wounds. So you can either internalize, let's say we're dealing with anger. You could internalize that anger, which is like giving yourself an emotional wedgie. You can externalize that anger, which is a bit like having a food fight with the world. Or you can have both, right? You can internalize and externalize that anger. And then we could do that with anger, we can do that with sadness, and we do it with fear. So that's why we have these 9 archetypal personalities that come out depending on what the core wound was and how you process that wound.
What's your core wound?
Okay, so I'm a type 3.
Okay.
So I use kind of race car, I think metaphors, or car metaphors, excuse me. I think they kind of take something a bit esoteric and ground it. So type 3, I call them the race car, or the achievers, what they're often referred to. And so type 3s have a sacred, I call this your sacred wound. So their sacred wound is sadness that we both internalize towards ourselves, meaning we feel sadness or shame or grief about how we perceive ourselves. But we also have this sadness or grief or shame about how we think others perceive us. And so you kind of have this stereophonic shame in a 3 that creates their core unique fear. And each type has a different core fear. And for 3, that fears that of being worthless, that there's something in my soul, or in my core of my being that feels like it needs always crying out for validation. And so that fear of being worthless takes 3s and tends to make us high performance achievers. We're always gunning for the next achievement, trying to win the race, get the pat in the head, but leaving our authentic selves in the dust, because we're so busy trying to be people pleasers and trying to win the approval of whomever is in front of us. We often have a very hard time knowing what our true authentic voice is, or what we really think and feel deep down, because we're so busy just changing masks all the time and wearing these personas. So that gives you the quick foundation of it.
Yeah, that's helpful. I'm a 3 as well, and my wife is a 3, and so I got a lot of 3 energy around all the time. And so I could see that, and I could see I'm constantly, I love words of affirmation. I love people to tell me really good things about me, and I could really sniff out when people are inauthentic in what they're saying about me. Like they're just saying something to say something, and I'm like, that doesn't do it.
Yep.
That's not right.
Yep.
So if you take this Enneagram, your core wounds, and you said at the beginning that you personally, you were fearful or avoidant of money. That was your attachment style as well. So in your story, how did it take the attachment style, how you were actually handling and dealing with money, and through then the lens of who you are, your personality, the Enneagram, how did you get to a healthier space in money?
Okay, let me walk you through what I call the shadow structure for a type 3. And there's obviously a unique shadow structure for each of the 9 types. And we talked, of course, just now about the sacred wound, about internal and external sadness, and then the greatest fear of being worthless. But then there's what I call, there's sort of a couple more steps to this. The next thing is what I call the greatest vice for a 3, which is deceit. Now, that doesn't mean that we're intentionally liars. Deceit just is that mask changing that we talked about, is that always putting a different persona on. And then that creates what I call your primary ego addiction, which is vanity. So 3s, we can be very vain about, we're not always even conscious of our vanity. We're just, every time we engage in something that gets us praise or self-promotion, it feels really good. And it feels good to every type, but especially to a 3. I think we're more addicted to that than others. And other types have their problems too. There's no one gets out of this without their issues. And so essentially then what I call the money monsters for type 3, if you're the money avoidant type 3, I'll call that person, like myself, the barrier, meaning we tend to be like an ostrich that buries our head in the sand because we don't want to look at the shame or the grief or sadness that all this money issues are causing for us. So we tend to just, not want to look at it because of all the negative emotions it triggers. So that tends to take our financial life and send it down the toilet, which is certainly was the case for me.
That was the case for me in my early 20s as well.
Yeah.
Like I did the exact same thing.
Uh-huh. Yep. And then, well, I'm sorry, brother. I actually, I think people who are money anxious have an easier time of it because
Yeah.
in some ways, because, if you're a money avoidant, first you have to figure out how to become financially literate, and then you have to learn, figure out how to make money. And, so you got these other layers you've got to overcome, where if you're money anxious and you're a type 3, I call that person the blinger, meaning it's an unhealthy relationship to money, but they're always concerned about the status symbols or having the fancy car, the fancy house, the corner office, whatever it is that they think is going to, but their financial life tends to look like a Hollywood set. It's beautiful on the outside, but it's all paint and plywood on the behind the scenes. And so there's maybe spending a lot. My dad was, I think, a blinger type 3. And so he actually, although he made quite a bit of money as an executive for an oil company, when he passed, he didn't have much left behind because he was in, I wouldn't say he was in terrible financial shape, but he certainly wasn't comfortable because he had lost so much of it over the years through various unfortunate, shall we say, decisions that he made with his finances.
As you were the barrier early on, what were you starting to realize within money, especially through the bankruptcy when you were in the monastery and your own financial literacy? What were you realizing in your life that you were actually being the barrier?
Well, I think part was looking around at all the other brothers in the monastery, and all of whom were good people, all of them most of them had advanced degrees, there were PhDs, there were, some of the most brilliant minds I've ever met. And yet we all had a different kind of money monster. We were all avoidant in some different way. And I couldn't quite figure out like why there was this sort of almost hatred of money, or this sort of idea that money itself is inherently corrupting or bad, when in fact you can't really get anything done in life without money in your pocket. And so realizing that, right, so what is it in me and what is it in us that's so resistant to this thing, and why are we even taking a kind of weird pleasure in the pain that it's causing? Like, what's kind of sadistic insanity are we going through all the time, and creating a lot of self-imposed austerity that served no purpose, didn't serve us. It certainly didn't serve the people around us, and it felt at times very unloving and in a kind of willful ignorance that I felt I needed to address in myself first and foremost. And so, I was able to do that over time, but it certainly wasn't easy. But understanding the Enneagram, and then, we've talked about the shadow structure, but then there's, an enlightenment structure that each of us have with our type that can help us reach a more, I think, fuller and happier life in all aspects of reality, but then also, especially when we apply it to money. So for type 3, first we have what I call a faux virtue, which is like your spiritual trap door that we all have. There's a virtue that's good for other types, but maybe not good for you. So for threes, I would say our faux virtue is assertiveness. Like type nines, for example, need to practice assertiveness because they tend to be a little on the slothful side. But type threes, when we're always engaging in vanity, assertiveness could for us reinforce that vanity. And because it is a virtue for other types, it may not necessarily be the best thing for us. But we want to start really our spiritual journey by practicing what I call your primary recovery virtue. And for us, that would be modesty. Now, modesty is not the same as humility. So humility is sort of kind of pushing your ego down, where I would say modesty is more about finding that balance, because we have this stereophonic shame. We've got this internal and external shame that we're dealing with. So you don't want to push yourself so far down that you trigger the internal shame. You don't want to pop yourself so far up that you trigger the vanity on the top side, right? So it's that modest, accurate self-assessment of your strengths and weaknesses internally for yourself. It's really knowing, what am I really capable of? What are my core competencies are, and not, at least speaking for myself, I tend to swing between sort of narcissistic delusions of grandeur and nihilistic despair. Sometimes I'm kind of between these two poles at my darkest moments, and then trying to find that balance where I really where it's not based on anything else going. I know where my center is. That would be the first thing that I think threes need to work on. And then we have what I call your secondary recovery virtue. And for three, that's faith. Now, that's not a faith in any doctrine or dogma. It's the faith to take the masks off and really let ourselves be seen for who we are. So when we practice modesty and faith together, that creates our super virtue for a three, which is authenticity. So when threes can really practice genuine authenticity, that's the thing that I think ultimately solves a lot of their spiritual problem and personal problems, because now that gets you out of the barrier mode, it gets you out of the blinger mode. And when you're living a truly authentic life, then that for a three fulfills their greatest hope, and each type has a greatest hope. But I think for a three, it's to feel completely valued. And when we're getting valued for the fake, vain, egotistical masks that we're wearing, it just bounces off. Like, it doesn't really work, right? So we're never going to feel genuine connection and validation until we're being validated for our authentic selves, which comes after the masks are taken off. And that feeling that completely valued, then I think leads to becoming a money master for a three, which I call the builder. So the money monsters are the barrier and the blinger. And then when they become a builder, that's the type three who's using their time, their tools, their talent in love and service to a suffering world to build something of significance in service to the world around them, and whatever that might be. It could be starting a podcast, it could be writing a book, it could be working, in a hospital, whatever, or whatever form of service whatever you feel that God put you on this planet to fix.
And a lot of believers have, there's all sorts of weird attachments to money, or non-attachment to money, or just thoughts about money. In 1 Timothy 6:10, a lot of people think it just says that money is the root of all evil, but it says that the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. Mm-hmm. So it's really more about the love of money, and it's the root of all kinds of different evils. Mm-hmm. But what should a relationship with money look like? What does a healthy relationship with money look like for us?
Yeah, and also in the Bible, in the New Testament, in the Greek, there's many, many different types of love. So there's layers of love. And so when you're saying that the love of money is the root of many evils, we're talking about a kind of superficial, materialistic love that has a negative, avaricious connotation to it. We're not referring to, say, agape love or the highest forms of love. And so I think that, the divine love of God can certainly be in money. How could it not be? Because money is simply the tool for action. And if we're using it and deploying our wealth in love and service, then I think that God can use that and does use that very, very well in a very healthy way. Or I like Mark Twain has a humorous quote where he said, it's the lack of money that's the root of all evil, and I think there's truth there too. So it's really about finding that healthy sweet spot, and it's without being too prescriptive about it. It's like, well, this is how it should be for you. It's like, no, my job isn't to tell you what your values are. My job is to help you figure out what your values are, to then articulate them for you and help you to live them as fully as you can, rather than imposing my worldview of how I think your life should be run. That's simply not how that ever goes well for anybody. But being able to have your values articulated, and then being using you now, not just your money, but your time. Like, that's the fun thing I've found about having a little bit of wealth, is like, oh my God, I have so much more free time when I'm not running around grinding for a paycheck every day. Like, I can wake up and I'm not hyper stressed. I'm not snapping at the people I love. I can have more leisure in my day, which is nice, but I also have the time to get out there and make a difference in ways that I couldn't when I just need to be at a desk making a living, all day, every day.
So there's three areas you talk about in dealing with our finances: what is earning, saving, investing, and getting healthy in those areas. Let's start with the earning part. If people are like, I just don't really know how to, yes.
Yeah. So I actually call them the 4 pillars of finance. So for
Okay.
me, the 4 pillars are earning, saving, investing, and giving. So I think it's about mastering all four of those areas. So you got to earn. So the first, if you're not making any money, you're broke. And then you have to save a portion of what you earn, because if you spend everything you make, you're broke. And then you need to save some of that money, and then you need to start off, of course, with an emergency reserve, typically 6 months cash on hand. And then you need to start taking stuff beyond that and investing it for your long-term future and capturing the compound growth of the market over time. And then it's just that simple. That's how most wealth in this country has been generated, in one form or another. It's just a variation on that theme. And then once you have sufficient resources, then it's okay. You've taken care of you. You've taken care of your family. Now hopefully you have something left over that beyond your needs and even beyond your wants and desires, so that you can have this extra income and extra capital that you can deploy to fix the crack in the world that you were born to repair.
So if people are caught in maybe cycles of poverty, generational poverty, and they're in a place of, well, everything that I have earned, I mean, it goes right away to pay my bills, to rent, just to survive. Yep. What does it look like then for people at that place? And I know it's different for different types and all that, but generally, what does it look like then to start to earn something and earn enough where they could start to save, and they could start to build this system and wealth over time?
Obviously, if you have a job that pays more, this is an easy process, right? If you're in a low paying job, everything gets more difficult. Everything in your life is going to be harder, but it's still doable. So every job, whatever, let's just say you're working construction, let's say, you're going to get a pay raise presumably every year. You're going to make more next year than you made this year by an amount that will hopefully exceeds inflation. So your net take home pay is going to be going up over time. And so if whatever your income is, you want to try to keep your spending at that sort of base level. And then as your income goes up, that's where you can find that extra that money to save, which then leads into investing, and then leads to a more robust financial future.
There's the healthy aspects of taming this money monster. Mm-hmm. But what happens when you're in a family, if you're in a relationship where you have two different money monsters and they're going after each other, right? They're eating each other up.
I know that. I know that feeling. I have been there. I have a working hypothesis, which is not scientific, but I can base it on my own anecdotal experience and those of my clients, which is, don't date your wings. Try not to date numbers that are immediately adjacent to you on the Enneagram. Doesn't mean that they're bad people. It means that you're probably going to trigger each other. The unhealthy aspects of your neighbors, if you're in a long-term relationship with that person, have a much higher propensity for conflict and strife than other combinations might, for reasons I could explain, but there's probably not time here. So I certainly found that in my relationship, my marriage that ended about 2 years ago, where my ex-wife and I, we each had our money monsters, and she was a very wonderful human being who kind of wanted to jump to the giving part maybe a little too fast, like who has a huge heart and wants to love and serve the world, but kind of got to earn a lot more money and save a lot more money before you're basically wants to give people my money, which is like, well, yeah, okay, I'm willing to I'm willing to give my money away, but I want to give my money away. I don't like you necessarily giving it all away or taking it or whatever the case may be. And I'm oversimplifying it, of course, and I'm sure she has her complaints about me. I'm not an easy person to live with, so not to put it all on her. So absolutely. And so I think part of the solving any problem is just you have to be able to acknowledge it, and knowing what your partner's Enneagram, knowing your Enneagram type, knowing your partner's Enneagram type, and then whether you're anxious or avoidant. And let me just clarify, I think you were trying to tease this out of me, is that we can be anxious and avoidant in different parts of our financial life. So in those 4 pillars of earning, saving, investing, giving, you could be an anxious earner, you could be an avoidant saver, we could be an anxious saver, an avoidant investor, and avoidant giver. You could mix and match those in any way you want, but you really need to get healthy in all 4 of them, at least to some degree, if you really want to build this stable, long-term financial future for yourself and for those you love.
What have you found to be the most helpful if you're working with clients, working with people to move from their unhealthy attachments into health in these areas? Like, are there steps that really help us unveil what is going on underneath? Hey friends, do you love shifting culture and want more? Well, subscribe to shiftingculture.substack.com for as little as $5 a month and get early ad-free access to every episode, along with exclusive articles and reflections you won't find anywhere else. Exciting conversations are coming up with guests like Caroline Leaf, Tony Collier, David Gate, Brian McLaren, Leonard Sweet, and many more. So subscribe now, hear episodes first, and join the conversation. And remember, leaving a rating and review helps new listeners discover the show. So visit shiftingculture.substack.com and subscribe today. Now on with the episode.
There's basically 3 tools of monasticism that will apply to all of us in different ways. Like, so the thing is that each Enneagram type has a slightly different prescriptive formula for overcoming their money issues, because they have unique ones. But the basic pattern is contemplation, right? You need to think deeply about what your issues really are. Then you need to have compassion for yourself, compassion for your caregivers who inevitably wounded you in childhood. They had to, in order for you to form an ego to be driving around in. And then you need to take action. You need to get off your butt. So it's about thinking deeply, feeling deeply, and then getting off your butt and doing something about it. And then applying that to each of those pillars of finance: earning, saving, investing, giving. Where are you falling down? And you might be falling down in all 4 areas, but most of us are probably having trouble in 1 or 2. But whatever your unique circumstances are thrown at you, then that's what you got to deal with.
In a typical hyper-individualistic, individualized culture, we try to do it all and figure it all out on our own, ourselves. What does it look like then to bring people along the journey to help us move and take steps towards health and growth?
One thing is to outsource things that you're not good at. Like, maybe you need to hire a CPA. Maybe you need an accountant, an attorney. Maybe you need different kind of financial experts to come in and help you get real specific professional help for a problem that you don't know how to navigate things through. Or it might be getting a therapist. It might be I do coaching. So if someone wants to go to my website, DougLynam.com, and wants me to spend an hour coaching them on their money issues, like that could be a really helpful way for some folks to go through this a lot more faster. Or I just read the book too. So I think there's lots of tools out there, and I think it's really important that you have a team and that you really aren't going it alone, because you you need people to mirror you. You need people who can accurately mirror your strengths and weaknesses back to you. And so you can really get to see yourself as you really are and find out, well, where am I? Like, what am I good at? And what can I do myself without too much trouble? And what are some things like, I'm a tad bit dyslexic at times. So there are just certain things like I don't really want to be placing trades all day. Like that's just probably not something I'm going to be good at. I can do it. It's just very stressful. I can do my own portfolio, but basically when I'm working in an office, I'm like, okay, somebody else needs to do that all day. I just have a limited capacity for it, in terms of push keys into a keyboard and expecting that the numbers are always going to come out right. So that's just one example of something that, all right, you've got this weakness. Now, how do you find a workaround or a hack that allows you to move forward without this one little quirk getting in the way too much?
One thing I love about community is that we could help each other out. So what did you find in your religious order, in the monastery, or within churches or different communities? How do communities then solve their money monsters? How do they become a place that is healthy, that is, moving from the individual to community? Like, for example, like there are pockets of I live in Kansas City. There are pockets where there's a whole community where they have their money monster they can't get over. It's like it is eating them alive, but it's the whole community. It's not
Yes.
just individuals in that community. It's the whole
Yes.
community. So what does it look like in the community to
Whew.
move forward? Just go into your own context, your monastery. How did the community then come together to say, whoa, we actually have this problem. We have bankruptcy. We have different things. Like, how did we get healthy together?
Well, I wish I could say we did. We got healthy, but mostly it felt like I was a bit of a workhorse and had to just take it on. And other people did other things, and other people were working very hard. But we were a small community, and I think the other brothers were happy to just let me run with it, and that created a bit of resentment over time, I have to say, because I was the youngest monk by like almost 20 years. And so as the most junior monk, there's sort of a hierarchical structure that you're living in where, it's based on seniority, and I had the least amount of seniority. So I had the least amount of real control or power in the community. And yet everything was running off of the money stuff, and so I think I would like to say that we ultimately came to a healthy space with all of it, but ultimately that's why I had to leave. Is I didn't feel like I was not in a position where you can't. It's really hard to change other people. Let's put it that way. Only person you can really change is yourself, and you can model better ways of behaving, and you can model better ways of living. But if other people don't want to, then you can't force them. And at some point, I just had to say, there's always going to be this sense that money is dirty, that having a little bit of wealth in our community is bad, and that even though they're happy to spend the money for things that are necessary, like there were some big medical bills that came up, and it's like, all right, God, thank God we have the money to, like, someone needs a quadruple bypass heart surgery. Well, yes, we have insurance, but then there's also some things that insurance doesn't cover. And so, being able to have those kind of reserves, I think every family needs that kind of ability to be able to survive the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And so there was genuine gratitude from the other brothers for getting us out of bankruptcy and putting us in a financially solvent situation. And yet there was also this underlying tension. And I didn't at that point I didn't know about the Enneagram. I didn't know about money monsters. All of this stuff that I'm presenting to you now is stuff I figured out after I had to kind of get out of there. And, I was being bombarded with what I didn't understand at the time, why we were all in this weird space around money all the time. And so I think this book is really the culmination of decades of financial fumblings and failures and frustrations to be able to help other people avoid some of those pitfalls.
You've hinted a little bit about, like, you're trying to help people determine their values when it comes to what they are wanting money to do for them and with them. How do we determine values? How do we go underneath? Like, what does it look like to say, this is actually what I want? Like, I could earn, I could save, I could invest, I could do all this stuff. I could be generous and I could give. But
Mm-hmm.
if it doesn't align to my values, if I don't know what they are,
Mm-hmm.
then none of it matters as much, right? So what does determining values look like for us in the way we deal with money?
I think each Enneagram type has a unique spiritual path, and we have different virtues that each one of the types, and there's all these subtypes as well. But without getting, again, it's think of the Enneagram as like a fractal. It's got infinite complexity inside of a firm structure. So we're talking about these 9 archetypal patterns, but there's an infinite variety inside each of them. So I want to make sure that your listeners are aware that we're not trying to put people into a rigid box here, but there are these broad categories that we've talked about of personality. And so we've just done the type 3, but we could pick any type. We could start with like type 8 is usually where I typically begin picking up the conversation for reasons that are somewhat arbitrary. But like type 8s, for example, they have this externalized anger. So 8s have anger. It was their sacred wound. And then they sort of they externalize that against the world. They're always pushing and challenging against the limits of reality. So 2 very famous type 8s would be Donald Trump and Dr. Martin Luther King, both type 8s, but they're both in very different ways, and are out there challenging the limitations and boundaries of the world around them. And then they have, their shadow structures, each the type 8s, but I think some of their, and I could go through the whole ego structure for a type 8, but ultimately I think the greatest virtue for a type 8 is innocence, is really being able to have, when you combine mercy and honesty for them, they get to this sweet innocence. Like some people think Mother Teresa was a type 8. And so that you get to this ability where almost the thing that was your greatest weakness becomes your greatest strength. So like we talked about a type 3, deceit's our greatest vice. Our greatest virtue then is authenticity. So for a type 8, it's their worst vice is sort of lustful vengeance. And then their greatest virtue would be sort of loving, honest, merciful innocence. And so I think that we could then go through all the different 9 types and see, all right, here are the value. These are values that I think will help you within your type be the healthiest, most loving expression of your personality possible.
As a 3 that puts on different personas and puts on masks in different groups that I'm in and trying to get approval, to really then go deep, like what do I desire? Who am I? Where is
Mm-hmm.
my authentic self? Like it takes a while. Then what are my values coming out of that?
Mm-hmm.
Not my values, because I think these are the values that other people want to see out of me, but the values that actually come from deep in my soul, that I know this is actually who God created me to be, and these are the values that I want to live out in the world. And it's a lot of work to go through this. It's not easy.
No, and maybe this is maybe the hardest answer to, I think, to the question you've been trying to tease out is, how do we do this? Like, and the answer is suffering. Basically, is
Thanks.
that's really, you have to go through some form of tremendous suffering to break open your ego and to help you see what your shadow is, and to see how it's causing pain for yourself and most importantly for the people around you. That you, a good friend of mine, his name's Richard Rohr, he often says, if we don't transform our pain, we're destined to transmit it, and most especially to those that we love, like our children. So we all have these childhood wounds that we grew up with, and again, they're necessary wounds to individuate. But if we allow them to fester, that we'll just keep passing that pain and trauma down to the generations, unless we're willing to do that inner work, let our suffering break us open, soften our egos, and then hopefully gain more love, wisdom, and compassion in the process.
So, Doug, if you can talk to your readers of Taming Your Money Monster, what is your hope? What do you want this
I,
to get out in the world?
I want people to build a robust financial life, however they want to define it, so that they don't have the kind of terrible money stresses and mistakes that I had growing up in my early adulthood, and that they are able to live a life that makes their soul sing. because it's really about having the time to be creative, to be doing the things that really feed you in your highest virtues, whatever they are for you, so that you're doing God's work. And again, it doesn't matter what your faith tradition is or what your belief system is on a theological level. It's like, okay, whatever that is for you, I want you to have the resources in your pocket so that you can be a force for love.
I have a couple quick questions I like to ask at the end. One, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Well, that's why I wrote the books. This is my second book, right? So the first book was called From Monk to Money Manager, a former monk's financial guide to becoming a little bit wealthy and why that's okay. So that first book was a how-to book. That really was about how do you do the nuts and bolts of basics of personal finance so you can, get that under control. And now this book, Taming Your Money Monster, 9 Paths to Money Mastery with the Enneagram, it's really a why-do book. This is just now I've taken all the psychological insights I've picked up along the way and packed them into sort of a why-do book of why we do stupid things with our money and how to stop doing that. And so I think together, they're basically everything I wish I had known and someone would have taught me when I was in my 20s.
Perfect. So you just give them your book, your 21-year-old self is
Yep.
that here, read this.
Absolutely.
And, that's perfect. That's good. Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
I'm a really big fan of Jordan Peterson these days. I think some of his writing is exceptional. I find his book 12 Rules for Life to be I was reading that again and enjoying his podcasts. There's a podcast called The Diary of a CEO that I also really enjoy. So those are some things that I've just been kicking around in my brain.
Where would you like to point people to? How can people get Taming Your Money Monster? How could they connect with you?
Yeah, the best way is to go to my website, DougLynam.com. That's DougLyn as in Nicholas, AM as in Michael.com. And there you can find links to all my social media and everything. But if you can also pre-order my book on Amazon, it comes out July 8th.
Well, Doug, thank you for this conversation. Thanks for actually going into the why we're all just not great with money, but we can be, and we can move towards financial health in the way that we actually handle our money, that we could actually have money with us, and we could do all sorts of great things, that we could be generous with our money, and we could give when we know what it is to handle our money monster. Thank you for relaying parts of your story. I think that really is helpful to get a grasp and a hold of what it looks like, and your knowledge of the Enneagram. I love your book is detailed. It is deep in psychology and money literacy. Like it has all sorts of incredible things in here. So you're not only, if you read Taming Your Money Monster, you're not only going to get some great whys when it comes to like money, but you're actually going to be able to deal with your wounds, your childhood wounds, and you're actually be just a better, healthy person through this. And so I loved that about it. So it's well done. It was great. So thank you for this conversation.
High praise, Joshua. Thank you very much. I am deeply flattered.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Shifting Culture. This show was edited and produced by me, Joshua Johnson, at Shifting Culture Productions. If you're enjoying the conversations, consider supporting the work by subscribing at shiftingculture.substack.com. For as little as $5 a month, you'll get ad-free early access episodes and other exclusive content delivered straight to your inbox. I'd love for you to not just listen, but engage. Reach out. Share what's resonating, and let's keep shaping culture together. Whether you're a listener with feedback, a creative with an idea, or a brand looking to connect with a thoughtful, engaged audience, let's talk. If you're interested in advertising on the show, I'd love to hear from you. Contact me directly for rates and availability. Until next time, let's keep shifting culture.